Story 1. The isolated cabin. Rebecca had always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. After years of city life, she decided to spend a weekend in a remote cabin she had rented online. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, promised a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of her daily life. Little did Rebecca know that her desire for solitude would turn into a nightmare. The cabin was a charming, rustic structure with wooden walls and a cozy fireplace. It was far off the beaten path, accessible only by a narrow, winding road that was barely visible through the dense forest. When Rebecca arrived, she was greeted by the serene beauty of her surroundings. The cabin was perfect, untouched and pristine. The first evening was peaceful. Rebecca enjoyed the quiet, relishing the absence of city noise. As night fell, she lit a fire in the hearth and settled into a comfortable armchair with a good book. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. She felt completely alone in the best possible way. However, as the night deepened, Rebecca started to notice something strange. The cabin seemed to be too quiet, almost unnaturally so. She couldn't hear the usual nighttime sounds of animals or the rustling of leaves in the wind. The silence was oppressive, and it made her feel uneasy. Around midnight, Rebecca decided to go to bed. She turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the dying fire to illuminate the cabin. As she climbed into bed, she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. She dismissed it as the sound of the old cabin settling or perhaps some small animal outside. The scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from different parts of the cabin, moving around as if something was trying to get in. Rebecca's heart raced, but she tried to calm herself, convincing herself that it was just her imagination running wild. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by a series of rapid, rhythmic thuds. The noise was coming from the roof. Rebecca's fear escalated. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside to check the cabin's roof, but she found nothing unusual. The night was still, and the forest was dark and silent. Back inside, Rebecca tried to convince herself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. She tried to sleep, but the scratching and banging continued intermittently throughout the night. Her anxiety grew with each passing hour, and she felt a growing sense of dread. By morning, Rebecca was exhausted. She packed her things quickly, eager to leave the cabin and the eerie silence behind. As she was loading her car, she noticed something odd, a series of footprints in the mud around the cabin. They were large and appeared to be from someone wearing heavy boots. The footprints circled the cabin, as if someone had been watching her from the outside. Rebecca's fear turned to panic. She hurriedly finished loading her car and drove away from the cabin, her mind racing. As she made her way back to civilization, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every shadow in the rearview mirror seemed to hold a potential threat. When Rebecca returned to the city, she contacted the rental company to report her experience. To her horror, the company revealed that the cabin had a troubling history. Previous renters had reported similar disturbances, but no one had ever investigated. The company promised to look into the matter, but Rebecca was left shaken. The experience left Rebecca with a deep mistrust of isolated locations. The cabin, once a symbol of peace and solitude, had become a reminder of the terrifying unknown that can lurk in the most tranquil settings. Story 2. The abandoned hospital. Michael had always been fascinated by abandoned places. He had explored numerous derelict buildings, but nothing prepared him for the horrors he would encounter in the old Westwood Hospital. The hospital had been closed for decades, its history marked by a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances. It was said to be haunted by the spirits of former patients and staff. One cold winter evening, Michael decided to explore the hospital. He entered through a broken window on the ground floor and was greeted by the musty smell of decay. The hospital was dark, its corridors dimly lit by the faint glow of his flashlight. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, and the air was heavy with a sense of abandonment. As Michael wandered through the hospital, he could feel the weight of its history. The once sterile halls were now filled with broken medical equipment and discarded papers. He took photos and notes, documenting the eerie atmosphere of the place. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Michael decided to explore the basement, where the hospital's old morgue and storage rooms were located. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, and the air was damp and stale. He descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The morgue was a chilling sight. Rows of metal trays lined the walls, and the cold, sterile environment was a stark contrast to the decay above. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. He took a few photos and moved on, his curiosity outweighing his fear. As he explored deeper into the basement, he heard a faint whispering sound. He stopped and listened, but the whispers were indistinct and seemed to come from all directions. Michael's flashlight flickered, and he felt a growing sense of unease. He tried to convince himself it was just the building's old wiring acting up. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, turning into incoherent murmurs. Michael's flashlight went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to replace the batteries. The whispers became more frantic, and he could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching. In the pitch-black darkness, Michael felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers became louder, and he could feel the presence of something or someone. The temperature dropped sharply, and Michael's breath became visible in the freezing air. Desperate to escape, Michael found his way back to the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps followed him, growing louder and more persistent. He stumbled up the stairs, his flashlight flickering back to life just as he reached the ground floor. Michael fled the hospital, his mind racing. As he drove away, he glanced back at the dark, looming structure. The whispers and footsteps had ceased, but the sense of dread remained. The experience had left him shaken, and he vowed never to return to the abandoned hospital. Back home, Michael reviewed the photos he had taken. In several images, he noticed strange, ghostly figures in the background, shadowy shapes that seemed to be watching him. The evidence of his encounter with the supernatural was undeniable. The abandoned hospital became a haunting memory for Michael, a reminder of the chilling experiences that can await those who venture into the darkness alone. The whispers and footsteps remained a constant reminder of the unseen forces that lurk in forgotten places. Story 3. The Haunted Forest Cabin. Emily had always loved the tranquility of the forest. When she found a secluded cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway, she was thrilled. The cabin was a small, charming structure nestled between towering trees, with no neighbors in sight. Emily anticipated a peaceful retreat, away from the noise of city life. The first night was serene. Emily enjoyed the crackling fire, the soft glow of the lanterns, and the natural sounds of the forest. As darkness fell, she marveled at the beauty of the star-filled sky through the cabin's windows. She settled into bed with a book, feeling perfectly content and isolated. But as the night wore on, Emily began to hear faint noises, scratching sounds coming from the walls and floor. At first, she thought it was just the cabin settling, or perhaps animals moving outside. However, the sounds grew more persistent, rhythmic, and unnervingly close. The noises seemed to move around the cabin, coming from different directions. Emily's anxiety increased. She tried to reassure herself, convincing herself it was just her imagination. She turned on the lights and checked the cabin, but found nothing out of place. The noises continued, now accompanied by what sounded like faint whispers. Unable to sleep, Emily decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and went outside, shining it around the cabin. The forest was still and dark, and she saw nothing unusual. The sounds had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. She returned inside, but the feeling of being watched remained. As she lay in bed, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling, Emily heard a loud bang from the attic. Her heart raced as she realized she hadn't explored the attic yet. The banging grew louder, accompanied by heavy footsteps. She knew she had to check it out. Summoning her courage, Emily climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. The air was cold and musty, and the light from her flashlight flickered as she moved. The attic was filled with old, dusty furniture and boxes. As she shone the flashlight around, she saw nothing unusual until she noticed an old, weathered mirror leaning against the wall. The mirror was cracked and dirty, but it seemed oddly out of place. Emily approached it, and as she did, she felt a chill in the air. Her reflection in the mirror appeared distorted, and she thought she saw a shadowy figure behind her. She spun around, but the attic was empty. Terrified, Emily decided to leave immediately. She packed her belongings quickly, her hands trembling. As she drove away from the cabin, she glanced back one last time. The cabin looked even more ominous in the dim light, the forest around it shrouded in dark. The next day, Emily returned to the city and tried to forget her experience. However, the memory of the scratching noises, whispers, and the shadowy figure in the mirror haunted her. She later discovered that the cabin had a dark history, with previous renters reporting similar disturbances. The knowledge only deepened her sense of dread.